bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Grave diggers.
Hey everyone, it's Amr coming to you live from Toronto.
And it's Erin coming to you from Seoul, South Korea.
Yay! No longer quarantining in a basement like Saddam Hussein.
I know, I'm now sitting in a loft with no furniture. I'm literally sitting on the ground. But life has actually improved. I promise that's an improvement.
Yeah, I mean, apparently lofts are common in Korea, as I learned talking to Erin. Koreans love having lofts, apparently.
Yeah. Today, we are not going to Korea with the pod, but we are over here in Asia.
Yeah, Southeast Asia to be specific. Now, before we get into it, I do have to warn our listeners, this is another one of those grim episodes we have. There'll be lots of mention of torture, sexual violence, gore. So if you are uncomfortable with that, that's understandable. You might want to skip this episode.
Yeah, we never want to catch you guys off guard and upset you. That is not the goal of this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. On September 30th, 1965, people went to bed thinking that tomorrow will be a day like any other. For Indonesians, however, that assumption was sadly wrong. In the early hours of October 1st, 1965, before the sun had even risen, members of the Gerakan 30 September movement initiated a failed push for power that will end up triggering a genocide. The G30S movement, as they were called, were basically mid-level Indonesian army officers who claimed they were defending then-President Sukarno's Indonesia from a plot by army generals that were going to stage a coup. Unfortunately, their preemptive strategy failed. Of the 7 generals they were supposed to capture, they only captured 6. General Nasution, the most important target and chief of staff, fled. Meanwhile, another general, Suharto, launched a campaign of bloodletting that would end up shaking Indonesia to its core. Suharto claimed that G30S was controlled by the Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKI, and that their women's rights wing, the Gerwani, committed satanic rituals on the captured generals that culminated with their torture and execution. Suharto, of course, presented no evidence for his claim, but then again, he didn't need to with the CIA and America behind him. Over a period of several months, he launched an extermination campaign that would result in over 1 million dead Indonesians, another 1 million displaced all over the world, and not to mention the countless survivors of torture camps set up by the Indonesian military. But to begin our story, I think we need to introduce Indonesia as a country and its history. So Indonesia consists of over 17,000 islands in Southeast Asia, the largest of which are Java, Sumatra, Bali, Borneo, and a number of smaller islands. It's also the world's 4th most populous country and the most populous Muslim majority country, which is always an interesting pub league question or pub quiz question. Most people assume the most populous Muslim majority is somewhere in the Middle East, though it's Indonesia. Interestingly, the Muslims in Indonesia were, and until recently are, split between a sort of Sunni Orthodox conservative Islam and what was popular but has been thoroughly repressed recently, a sort of animistic, syncretic Islam that blended Muslim teachings with local traditions, local pre-Islamic traditions. Other minorities in the island constitute Christians, Buddhists, and Hindus. Of ethnicities, there is a significant Chinese minority, especially in Java, and they usually occupied a sort of merchant class in the city.
Yeah, as Amr just said, Indonesia is a very diverse country, and colonial powers interfered unevenly in different areas and among different groups. We see something similar with Germany and Belgium in Rwanda. By privileging some groups within the colonial administration and oppressing others more harshly, colonial powers can create a fractured society that makes solidarity between communities more difficult.
Exactly. And the interesting thing often is that these colonial powers will pick a sort of minority that they know once they withdraw, the minority can be very vulnerable. So, and the minority ends up relying on the colonial power for sort of protection. Like the Alawites in Syria, the Tutsis in Rwanda. It's very heinous, really. It's very disturbing.
Right. And it also sows resentment, usually among that majority who sees the minority thriving a bit more economically.
Yeah, a national bourgeoisie of sorts.
Hmm.
So Indonesia was occupied by the Dutch East India Company, which was pretty much a subsidiary of the Netherlands since 1602. And it remained occupied up until World War II when Japan invaded and conquered the islands. And it's interesting because Indonesians in general saw Japan as a sort of like fellow Asians and as liberators who removed the sort of hated Dutch colonial masters.
I can tell you here in Korea that Japan does not have a popular history.
Korea and China, especially, not big fans of Japan. I don't think Japan has even like recognized their war crimes. Like they haven't even like officially acknowledged most of their war crimes.
No, there are several movements here, especially by Korean women, to try to get Japan to acknowledge the horrible things that were done to Korea, especially during World War II.
Yeah, I mean, Indonesians initially, and their hopes were definitely dashed very quickly during World War II. But weirdly enough, during World War II, you had nationalist leaders like Muhammad Hatta and Sukarno who sort of wined and dined with the Japanese elite, assuming that the Japan, like sort of trying to build a friendly relationship with Japan under the assumption that Japan will grant them their independence. It's really fascinating if you think about it. I think it sort of mirrors various Middle Eastern countries supporting the Axis powers as a sort of anti-British or anti-French sentiment, if you will.
Yeah, Benedict Anderson has actually written really extensively on that.
Yeah, actually, Benedict Anderson has spoken a lot about Indonesia specifically too. I'll get back to that later on. At the end of World War II in August, Japan surrenders. And once Japan surrenders, right after Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, as I just mentioned, declare independence, naming Indonesia an independent republic with Sukarno as its first president. And that basically touches off a brutal armed struggle against the Dutch that ends in 1949 when the Netherlands end up recognizing Indonesia as an independent republic due to international pressure, of course. This sort of reminds me of how France tried to reoccupy Vietnam after World War II. But before I want to get into the genocide, I'll get into who Sukarno was because he's a sort of central figure of this story. He was born to a Muslim Javanese aristocrat and his Hindu Balinese wife, which I think is a sort of microcosm of Indonesia, where you have all these ethnic minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities, linguistic minorities, all living synchronously, and intermarriages were common, religions were quite coexistent. There was no aggression, if you will. There was no hardline stances.
Yeah, intermarriage, at least in my opinion, is a pretty good measure for how people are integrated within a society. Religion is one factor, of course, but even class, like a society that has a lot of inequality in class, you do not see people from the upper echelons of society marrying poor people. Rarely, rarely does this happen. And when it does, it's some sort of Cinderella story, basically.
Yeah, it's either a Cinderella story or a big controversy and scandal.
Yeah.
I find it interesting though because it's fascinating how like in certain societies, religion and sect take the place of what race would be in Western countries like in Northern Europe and like North America. Like race is sort of subsumed into the idea of sect. So like your sect, regardless of whether you go to the mosque or the church or you actually believe in God or practice, your sect in terms of like how you speak, your dialect, your last name defines your social position in many ways. I do think marriages are a very interesting way of measuring how a society is integrated or not. And that's why I think, and we have spoken about this before, but I think a certain brand of leftist sort of horseshoe theory, race essentialism on who can marry who and who can't marry who is as damaging to sort of solidarity as the sort of extreme racist rights campaigns against interracial marriages or inter-class marriages and so on and so forth.
I do understand people, especially from an oppressed background or with a very specific history, might want to be in a relationship with someone who has a very specific kind of empathy about that. I can understand that, but I don't understand policing the community in that way. If you are a type of person that needs to be with someone of your same background because maybe you have trauma there that you need them to understand, I get that, really, but I don't think you could tell everyone in your group that it's wrong to go outside the group.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely second that. I think there's a difference between a sort of personal preference, and I could testify to that. Like, all of my sort of serious exes are of Bahraini background. And I guess that's because I found it much easier to sort of empathize with someone who went through a similar childhood as me. And that's fair, but I'm never going to go to like Bahrainis and be like, well, you know, if you date white people, then you're a race traitor or whatever, or the sort of justification that like white people can't date people of color or whatever because of power dynamics. I think that's absurd. And your personal preference is completely different from sort of political dogma, if you will.
Well, I think there are lots of different power dynamics in a relationship. We talked about this in our bonus episode on O.J. Simpson, where, yes, if someone is using their position of power to abuse their partner, like, that's disgusting. I just don't think we can always automatically assume that, like, interracial or intersect relationships are abusive. That's ridiculous.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with that. But yeah, I mean, Sukarno, going back to Sukarno, he was a product of this interracial and interclass marriage, and he grew up fairly well off thanks to his dad. In 1927, he went to Bandung to study engineering, and much like a lot of people of that era, he sort of gets subsumed by the nationalist anti-colonial movement in the universities and becomes one of the founders of the Indonesian Nationalist Party, the PNI. He ends up being arrested by the Dutch colonial police in 1929. They sentenced him to 4 years in prison, but he ends up being released after 1 year due to international pressure in January 1931. And he ends up getting arrested again later that year. And this time, instead of being sent to prison, he's sort of shuffled around from island to island in a sort of internal exile until Japan invades, as I said, becomes friendly with Japan, hoping to acquire some sort of recognition for his independence movement. When Japan surrenders in August 1945, and this is a kind of very absurd story, it's Mr. Bean-esque, really. Sukarno initially procrastinates on making a decision. He doesn't want to declare independence immediately. He's afraid of triggering both the sort of remaining Japanese troops there and worried about providing a cause for invasion for Britain or the Netherlands. That decision was taken from him because on the 16th of August 1945, 3 young students, very impatient, kidnap him and pretty much force him to declare independence by gunpoint, and he ends up doing so on 17th of August 1945.
It's interesting how, in our historical review of these sorts of things, assassination doesn't seem to really do a lot for your movement, but kidnapping might be where it's at.
Yeah, it's almost like kidnapping is a sort of like the sweet spot where you can get things done.
Yeah, because if they would have killed him, he would have been gone. It would have created probably some sort of power vacuum or, struggle for power, and independence might be pushed to the side, whereas the kidnapping, they got it done.
Yeah. Das Criminal here, we are good at giving advice to our listeners. So if you want to get something done, kidnap a political leader, force them to make declarations for you.
Don't write it down.
Yeah, no diaries, no letters, please, for the love of God.
Don't talk to the media.
Don't make any phone calls. One of the interesting things about Sukarno, though, is that upon his assumption as president, he makes Bahasa Indonesia the official language. And that's a sort of Malay lingua franca, sort of Creole type of language that was usually spoken in the ports across the islands. Because Indonesia, like I said, is composed of like 17,000 islands and over 700 plus languages. So Bahasa Indonesia was a sort of Malay synthesis that was spoken to facilitate trade between the islands. And the fact that Sukarno, who was Javanese, could have easily picked Javanese as the national language given their majority. Instead, he picked this Bahasa Indonesia. It was a great, and I think a very strategic move in cultivating a national identity based on a sort of anti-colonial emotions. From 1945 to 1949, there was a brutal war with the Netherlands that was, it was hot and cold depending on the time of year. Eventually, the Indonesian Republicans, they win. They declare independence. But during the war, you had all this sort of instability where you had Islamists seceding in Sumatra, for example, causing guerrilla war that ended up being suppressed. And in 1948, the Communist Party launches an uprising, a people's uprising in East Java, and that had to be put down by the Indonesian military. And this sort of instability between all these different factions, you have the Islamists, you have the PKI, you have the military. Sukarno emerges between all of these factions as a sort of dialectical synthesis, a sort of balancing act between every single faction vying for power. One of the most famous events of the era was in 1955, and it was the Bandung Conference hosted in Bandung, Indonesia. It was a plan to bring together the post-colonial world of Asia and Africa, where the non-aligned movement was established, which was basically a movement that claimed that these countries would not strictly support either the USA or the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but forge their own sort of independent foreign policy while also assisting each other.
From a post-colonial perspective, the non-aligned movement is a smart way for newly liberated states to go, because alone they might be too small to resist the economic and military pressure from the world's superpowers, but together they stand a chance of maintaining independence. But still, as we'll see in Indonesia, being part of the NAM doesn't make countries immune to corruption, meddling, and even full-scale collaboration with powers like the United States.
Yeah, exactly. And if you remember our previous episode, episode 6 on Iran, just because you as a country say that you're independent or non-aligned, it doesn't mean that America will treat you as such. Especially America. The Soviet Union was much less inclined to intervene abroad. They were much more insular, save for like Eastern Europe, which they saw as their backyard. But America especially had this weird, especially after the election of Dwight Eisenhower in 1953, you had this weird obsession with communism and being anti-communist and the assumption that if you're not our friend, you're by definition a communist. So regardless of these non-aligned movements sprouting out, the US treated any non-friendly regime as by definition hostile and potentially communist.
Yeah, and when we say non-friendly, we don't mean even like openly against the United States. We mean literally everyone who doesn't kiss the feet of the US. People like Lumumba, for instance.
Yeah, and give random concessions to US companies to like dig up whatever they could get. Yeah, and this was obviously spearheaded by the notorious Dulles brothers, as you see in episode 6 on Iran. You know what's funny, actually? Sukarno basically was trying to keep the US as happy as possible, and he did so to the point that the Bandung Conference in 1955 was organized on the same day that Paul Revere rode the midnight ride to announce the American Revolution or whatever. I'm not too familiar with American history. On 18th of April 1955, it was like the anniversary of Paul Revere. And yeah, he was trying to send a message to America that like, we're not your enemies, we're just trying to do our own thing. Like Aaron said, I mean, it doesn't matter what you do. At the end of the day, the US will see you as hostile if you're not kissing its feet. And Sukarno's sort of friendliness to the Communist Party and his desire to work with them basically put him on America's target list, their bullseye. So they send a CIA agent by the name of Howard Palfrey Jones to determine the best course of action in Indonesia. And over the decade, Jones encourages the US to cultivate anti-communist sentiment with the Indonesian army, which leads to various programs where Indonesian officers are basically sent to America to train, especially in Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And they get to live like nice and luxurious apartments and, get everything paid for by the US while being indoctrinated with right-wing anti-communist ideology. So, whenever you hear all these claims that the US can't afford universal healthcare, it's because your taxpayer money is going to train foreign military officers to act as buffers against communists. In 1958, a secessionist movement exploded in Sumatra again, and this time the secessionists set up a revolutionary provincial republic of Indonesia. These consisted of dissident military officers supported by the Islamist Masyumi party. Interestingly enough, the Indonesian army immediately discovered that these secessionists were fighting with very advanced weaponry, not something you can pick up on an island like Sumatra. It turns out, and we discovered this in April of 1958 when a US citizen by a name of Alan Pope was shot down by the Indonesian military delivering weapons via plane. And he's shot down and captured, and the fucking idiot has his US passport with him. Again, the theme of this episode. Don't carry documents with you, don't write things down. Paper is bad. Basically revealing the US and CIA backing of the secessionist movement.
At first, actually, the US government tried to portray Pope as a mercenary and expressed embarrassment that an American had become involved in conflict in Indonesia. But of course, it was soon revealed that the US government was involved in the entire operation, showing that denials of military entanglements by the US are not to be trusted.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could also see our episode on the murder of Orlando Letelier and the US denials there, where they were pretending that they were completely innocent, but then you have basically the CIA working with the Chilean intelligence to organize the assassination.
Right, and as we've discussed in many episodes, this is horrible for many reasons. One of them being because now, when there are revolutionary movements in certain countries or popular movements, people will accuse those in that movement of being paid CIA shills and all of these things. And it really is the boy who cried wolf, but sometimes it is true. Like, this isn't based in fantasy. These are things that have happened.
Yeah, time and time again. And it's really depressing how they sour people and make people so paranoid, which I guess is another success for the CIA, is making people so paranoid that no mass movement can come without infighting and accusations of being a CIA agent.
Right, and it makes change in countries where the USA is very involved, such as Amar's home of Bahrain. It makes change very, very difficult.
Yeah, nigh impossible, really. Sometimes I am to dance with despair, if you will. So after the military, and at this point, having been discovered, the US pulls all support for the PRRI and they get crushed by the Indonesian military. Sukarno sees this as a great victory, and in 1959 uses this victory as a sort of reputation boost. And because of all this infighting and this factionalism, he sort of takes a belief that liberal democracy was a failure and moves towards what he calls guided democracy, but what really ends up being ruled by presidential decree, where he just decrees everything individually. And he succeeds at doing that mainly by being propped up as a sort of compromise between the communists, the military, and the Islamists, all of which are afraid of making a move too early and being outmaneuvered by the other two factions. In 1963, during his guided democracy phase, Sukarno ends up triggering a confrontation, what he called confrontazi, with the United Kingdom over the creation of Malaysia. Because Malaysia was being created at that time, Sukarno alleged, and with good reason, that Malaysia was being created as a client state because the way the UK were drawing the borders, they were making sure that the Chinese ethnic group in Malaysia were going to be a minority because they were afraid the Chinese were sympathizers with communism. And so the borders were drawn up and down to make sure there were no Chinese majority, while also excluding Singapore as a city-state and a sort of dictatorship. This sort of low-level border conflict lasted until 1966, but it's important because its beginning soured relationships between Indonesia and the US and UK, and the coldness of this relationship basically pushed Indonesia into further friendly relations with the Soviet Union and Maoist China, which basically proved to the US that Indonesia was going to fall to communism. And so the US intelligence apparatus basically fast-tracked a plan to get rid of Sukarno, seeing this development. This plan, of course, was also accelerated because Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded him, was a lot more anti-communist and a lot less tolerant of third worldist and non-aligned movements and preferred the proverbial stick to the carrot. This leads us, of course, to the Gerakan 30 September, which is a movement formed by this mid-level Indonesian army officers who were discontent by what they saw as the upper echelons of the Indonesian military being very rabidly right-wing and anti-communist. And it's not to say that the mid-level Indonesian officers themselves were communist, but there were rumors of plots by the upper levels against Sukarno, and these mid-level officers were nationalist and pro-Sukarno. So they moved quickly in what they thought was a way to protect Sukarno and the Indonesian Republic's independence. Their aim was to kidnap 7 of the top army's brass and execute them and seize public spaces, declaring support for Sukarno, hopefully mobilizing a sort of pro-Sukarno movement and suppressing anti-Sukarno dissent.
It's still not totally clear why the pro-Sukarno officers decided to do this. Yes, they wanted to suppress dissent and hopefully promote some sort of mass mobilization that would remove more right-wing army officers and politicians from their positions. But why they decided that this intramilitary coup was the best step is still a bit hazy.
I was reading Vincent Bevan's book, which I do recommend, The Jakarta Method. There were a lot of theories floating around. Benedict Anderson, as we discussed earlier, his theory, and this got him, by the way, kicked out of Indonesia by propagating this theory, was that the G30S movement was literally what it said it was. It had nothing to do with the PKI or communists, and it was just a movement of mid-level officers who were very poorly organized and very poorly led, and basically jumped the trigger way too early in an effort to contain what they thought was going to be a coup. There were also a sort of more extreme claims and suspicions. And to be honest with you, I could see this happening too. That G30S was, what do I call it? A deep fake, basically, where the US and the UK basically infiltrated the movement, not directly, but through their military contacts. And that the dictator Suharto, which we'll get into in a bit, was aware of this movement and basically triggered the coup early just to justify the counter coup and to suppress the leftists. Actually, this reminds me a lot of when there was a coup in Turkey, I believe, against Erdogan that was basically a failed coup. It was completely disaster. And Erdogan used that as justification to purge the military of all and non-loyal elements and the judiciary. And there were claims that, Erdogan was aware of this coup and basically let it happen so he could justify his counter reaction.
It's not unheard of.
Yeah, I imagine it's a very common plot. Speaking of which, 1964 to 65, the US and UK begin fomenting a plan for a coup against Sukarno. And the UK ends up establishing a director of political warfare position in Singapore, while MI6 and CIA end up conducting black ops. We still don't know the extent of the financing and the planning, but the plan initially was to goad the communists into action to suppress them. This also is seen in the publication of the Gilchrist letter, which was a letter allegedly written by the British ambassador in Indonesia, Andrew Gilchrist, to the US ambassador, suggesting that elements in the Indonesian army were preparing a plot. The US and the UK alleged that it was a forgery, it wasn't real, it was forged by the communists. The communists alleged that it was completely real, But the third option is that, going as per the above claims, that it was a deep fake that was planted by the US, hoping that the left would discover it in order to trigger or goad the left elements into a confrontation with the army that they were bound to lose.
At this point, Indonesia was on the verge of more social reform that would see more land redistribution and industry nationalization. Those most threatened by such policies included military businessmen and rural landowners, who benefited from economic inequality while most people in Indonesia suffered.
Yeah, actually, it's weird because it seems that of all the social reform programs across the world, nothing gets the US more agitated and more ready to overthrow a government like land reform.
Well, that makes sense, though, because the Soviet Revolution and later the revolution in China, land reform was a really big part of those movements, especially in 1917, right? Like overthrowing the feudal system and establishing a more equitable society was really based in material reforms like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to realize that for a lot of quote unquote third world countries or developing countries, the vast majority of the population at that time was still rural. It was still peasants. And in order to get the peasants on your side, if you're a leftist organization, nothing convinces peasants more than land reform. The 30th of September movement initiates their plan, as the name suggests, on the 30th of September 1965. They organized 7 teams to capture the top generals, and their main target was the chief of staff, Nasution, as well as Lieutenant General Ahmad Yani. 6 of the 7 are captured, except for Nasution, who escapes by jumping over his fence at home and hiding with his neighbor, who was the Iraqi ambassador. In the clash, his 5-year-old daughter is killed, sadly, and his assistant was captured instead. 7:30 a.m. of the 1st of October, the day after, the G30S movement broadcast an announcement by their leader, Lieutenant Colonel Untong, declaring that the movement succeeded in preventing a coup against Sukarno. And on 9 a.m., Sukarno arrives at Halim Air Base, which was being the G30S headquarters. As soon as he arrives, he realizes that the 6 generals who were captured were already dead when he arrives, that this movement was very chaotic, there was no organization, and there was no logistical support. And within 12 hours of his arrival, the movement completely collapses. General Suharto is informed of this movement. General Suharto, by the way, at this point is a general who was the leader of Kostrad, which is the Army Strategic Reserves Unit, which can mobilize up to 35,000 soldiers if needs be. And he's notified of the movement. Interestingly enough, he was never a target by G30S, even though he's a high-ranking officer. He was never targeted by them. And so when he was informed of the sort of coup, he mobilizes the Kostrad, the reserves, and moves through Java, basically convincing the surrender of most of the G30S troops who were completely discombobulated. And without firing a shot, takes control of Jakarta. Yeah, within that same day, he takes control of the government. He seizes all mass communications. He basically locks up Sukarno in a presidential palace and immediately begins disseminating allegations that the G30S movement was actually controlled by the Communist Party, the PKI, and that the PKI's feminist wing, the Gurwani, had women dancing naked while castrating the generals, cutting off their penises, torturing them, gouging their eyes, and killing them. Very weirdly gruesome stuff to describe.
Yeah, and also false, obviously.
Yeah, all of it was lies. None of this was proven. Even like Benedict Anderson reported like 20 years later that the autopsy reports for all of the 6 generals that were found in a well, 5 of them were killed by shots to the back and 1 by stab wounds in what appears to be a scuffle with a bayonet. So there was no gouging of eyeball. They all had their penises intact. They were like, it was all fake.
Yeah, it's just scapegoating women, too, and feminists.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it seems that it plays upon the sort of latent fear that, communists are going to come and castrate you, women are going to be liberated, and they're going to be naked everywhere. It's a sort of cultural war cornerstone, really.
What's wrong with women being liberated and naked? Like, who has a problem with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for that, both liberation and the nudity. But, I mean, our friends at the BBC, the Voice of America, and Radio Australia, they don't seem to be big fans. So they regurgitate Suharto's lies as truth. And that's where the genocide begins. So within days, a national monument is erected for the killed generals. A state funeral is held to commemorate them as martyrs. And currently, October 5th is celebrated in Indonesia as the Armed Forces Day. Very normal, that. Defense Minister Nasution, who escaped, recognizes Suharto's supreme leadership. And immediately, Suharto, Nasution, and other high-ranking elements begin spreading propaganda denouncing the Communist Party as infidels, as kuffar, and as degenerates, basically launching pogroms beginning in villages in Sumatra.
Another common rallying cry by the counter-revolutionaries was Ganyang PKI, which means crush the PKI. Suharto intended not only to reverse the social reforms pushed by his predecessor, but to totally eviscerate the leftist organizations in the country.
Oh yeah, there was no mercy, he was ruthless, there was no compromise with this. He was gonna disappear, murder. Everything was on the table. What's interesting, though, is that the PKI was, at that point, right before the coup, the third largest communist party in the world in terms of membership, right after the Soviet Union and Maoist China. Unlike the former two, the PKI was very much of the democratic socialist bent. They believed that they could achieve communism through elections and party politics. And so initially, when the news begins to come out that the G30S movement was, kidnapped Sukarno, they're degenerates, etc., the police at local stations across Indonesia would ask PKI members to come in for questioning. And a lot of PKI members came in voluntarily because they thought it was very normal. Like, yeah, we had nothing to hide. We'll just show up and we'll answer a few questions and we'll be let go. We're obviously innocent. They had no idea what the government had planned for them.
If the police ever ask you to come in and answer some questions about something, say no, get a lawyer. Don't just walk in all willy-nilly, because even if you haven't done something wrong, it's actually sometimes harder to prove innocence, because if you're innocent, you're not keeping track of all your movements trying to come up with a story. Right? If someone asked you what you were doing last week at a certain time, my response would probably be, I don't know, I was at work maybe, I was making dinner, who knows?
Yeah, exactly. No, like, I'm just thinking now, because you said what were you doing last week. Honestly, I can't tell you because I don't feel obliged to remember specific instances at specific hours. Like, yeah, I was probably at work. I probably worked out after, I don't know.
Yeah, and now imagine they're asking you something about a coup that happened months ago. Like, I wouldn't be able to tell you where I was. Probably at home. Probably watching TV.
Netflix, yeah. It's so sad because these people genuinely believed in a sort of democratic socialist institution. And when the cops were like, yeah, just come in, it's fine, they had no reason to be suspicious initially because they genuinely believed the media claiming that this coup was suppressed by the military and that the military was protecting the country. So they went in and they never came out. A lot of them just never came out. And that's just so sad. It's genuinely heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Once these members would come into the police station, they'd be thrown in jail, interrogated over a period of days or weeks. Women were often tortured and raped in these facilities, just sad to say, by the guards, by the police officers. People would just go into interrogation rooms and just never come out. Interestingly enough, a lot of the people that were arrested because the CIA, as soon as the coup happened on October 1st, the CIA sends a list of all the known PKI members as well as suspected communists and communist sympathizers directly to the Indonesian military. So they knew what they were doing. The CIA knew what they were doing. The Indonesian army knew what they were doing. It wasn't accidental. It was pre-planned from the get-go. One of the interesting things, too, was that the military was being supported by various militias, including the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia, the Nahdlatul Ulama, and they had armed wings called the Ansor and the Banser. And these armed wings were leading death squads in killing what they called communists up and down Java, Sumatra, Bali, basically any communist or suspected communist they could get their hands on. One of the other really, really sad and depressing situations or phenomena is the military going around and press ganging civilians into carrying out executions. So if you were suspicious looking or whatever, the military will come to you and drag you out to a beach or underneath a bridge and hand you a pistol to execute someone you probably knew from your village as a teacher or a worker. In this way, I think it's really both ingenious and really depressing because they managed to make sure everyone who wasn't killed would basically be guilty of participating and thus sort of share the collective guilt.
That's so awful.
Yeah, it's depressing. I was reading Bevins' book and he mentions how a lot of the people he interviewed basically were alcoholics because of this. Like after they were press ganged into doing this, they basically resorted to drinking to forget what they were doing.
Yeah, I would.
It's hard because I don't blame them as individuals because the choice was between them being executed for communism or killing someone else. And if you have a family, if you have young children, if you have people you take care of, then it's very hard to stand by your principles and demand to be executed.
Yeah, also, it's not like you can appeal to authority, like call the police. This is the police.
Yeah, and they're telling you, either you kill this guy or we kill you and this guy. So, what's your choice? I would find it very hard in that instance.
Just terrible.
Yeah, of course, this was supported by the landlords, by the religious establishment. The worst of it was in Bali, where 5% of the island's 80,000 people were killed. And one of the favored methods of killing in Bali was machetes, which were brought in from Java. And these paramilitaries were using machetes to basically hack people to death. PKI, suspected communists, just disappeared. Bodies were never found. And we spoke about this in the podcast before, but disappearing is a very useful strategy for a lot of authoritarian regimes, because if you know your family is dead, you have nothing to lose anymore. So you can participate in a resistance. But if your family has disappeared, you might harbor the hope that they're still alive and so fall into line hoping that they'll be released if you obey the authority. At the end of the day, the results are just depressing. Over 1 million Indonesians were killed in a period of 6 months from October 1st, 1965. The ethnic Chinese minority were especially targeted for the belief that they were communist sympathizers. Over 1 million people fled Indonesia, settling all over the world, including in Brazil, other places in South America, places in Europe, including the Netherlands. And we have no idea how many were tortured. There has yet to be an official reconciliation report or any sort of truth committee in Indonesia. We have no idea how many women were raped, how many men were tortured. All we know is that after that, Sukarno was sidelined. He was forced to sign a document authorizing Suharto's military power. And in 1967, he's stripped of his presidency, he's put on house arrest, and he dies in 1970. And Suharto ends up continuing his presidency until 1998. Like I said, Indonesia still doesn't recognize the historicity of these murders, of this torture.
How awful. How depressing.
Yeah, this was a very depressing episode. By the way, I picked this topic, so sorry guys for depressing you with your Monday morning.
But it's an important one to talk about and definitely doesn't get enough attention.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's also important because this genocide, I would like to call it a genocide because it was very much targeted and very much organized. It became a template for the later violence in South America in Operation Condor, as we discussed earlier. It was the first of many violences. And if you ever hear right-wing politicians mention the Jakarta method or Operation Jakarta, they're talking about purging people in your country.
And it also wasn't that long ago. I mean, like, my parents were alive when this happened. They were very, very young, but they were alive.
Yeah, I think my parents would have been in high school at this point or in early university. Yeah, it's just sad. Bevins interviews survivors of the torture camps who are living in the Netherlands, Brazil, one in Switzerland, I believe. Yeah, and they're all alive. They're all old, but they're all alive, and their entire generation had their lives robbed and their livelihood completely shattered by this.
I don't know how you could get over it. You just have to learn to live.
It's one of the many instances of 20th century violence that is so recent and yet so not talked about. And when people talk about countries like Indonesia being not doing economically well or being unstable, or even like talking about how conservative Indonesian Islam has become insofar as the spread of sort of Sunni Orthodox Islamist beliefs, no one mentions the sort of the precursor, right? The sort of backing of these hard right elements by foreign entities and the sort of mass murders that led to this instability.
Yeah, very true.
I'd like to think that in a parallel universe, Sukarno continued his social reforms and Indonesia is a successful developed country. But, ultimately we live in this world and we have to reckon with the past and move forward, live, and hopefully form a better world.
Yes, I agree.
So on that really depressing note, we can close it up for this week. I hope you guys learn a lot from this episode, but not let this episode put you into the brink of nihilism. There is work to be done, and we have to fight for a better future. There's no other option.
Definitely. If you do enjoy the podcast, we have a Patreon page, which you can check out, patreon.com/dascriminal. We post a lot of bonus content. Next week, we are posting a book review of Tom Mill's The BBC Myth of a Public Service, which I have started to read, and it's very interesting, so please come check that out. We do full-length bonus episodes as well, and you get a shout-out when you sign up. Plus, you get to participate in polls, so that's very fun.
Yeah, you don't want to miss our next episode. I've been reading the BBC as well, and it's a very fascinating book. Yeah, you also get access to our backlog of previous content, all the mini episodes, all the bonus episodes, so please do check us out.
Yes, and you can find us on Instagram at dascriminalpod. We post photos, maps, things like that correspond with our episodes. We never post gruesome content, so do not worry about those sorts of images coming up on your feed. We specifically avoid that.
Yeah, definitely.
We will be back next week for the rest of you on Monday for another full-length episode. We also have some exciting news coming out of Das Criminal podcast space, so keep an ear open for that.
Yeah, very juicy news. So until next time, I hope everyone has a good Monday and a good rest of your week, and I'll see you next Monday. Take care, everyone.
Bye.